where do I go from there, huh? Okay. So actually, I did want to give a hand to the team. I think the food truck thing was probably one of the most creative lunchtime things I've seen. So can everybody give them a hand, please? Great. So yeah, I feel like I need to tell you a little bit about myself before I begin, because I think it's going to help sort of frame sort of how I think about communities and how I think about quality of place. First of all, I guess piggybacking what Kim talked about earlier, I'm a Gen Xer. So I'm honest, direct, unfiltered, and skeptical. So I get in trouble a lot in my job. I really go into a lot of communities, and I'm very upfront with what I see, what I think is going on in those communities. And so today I'm going to give you a little bit of how I think about the places that we're going to visit as we think about quality of place. I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania. Anybody ever been to Erie, Pennsylvania? All right, great. So it's also called the Mistake on the Lake, right? Interesting place, a lot of beautiful assets, but really not doing enough with them, honestly. I think, when I was growing up, I got to see the demise of manufacturing in that community firsthand. My dad worked at General Electric, a plant that went from 36,000 people down to 500 right now, and next year will be completely gone from Erie. So I get to see that firsthand and what kind of battle scars that left that community in terms of not just those jobs, but the lives that were ruined as a result of that demise of that sector, of the relationships that were broken. And what's left in that community is a lack of trust. And we heard a lot about that. It's a generational thing. And so you see that happening in that community. So when I go there now, I see a community that really lacks that civic infrastructure to think about what's next. How do we recreate the community? And I'll talk more about civic leadership later on as I go through my remarks. I moved on, went to school, went to the University of Pittsburgh, and then I ended up starting to work in state government for a number of years. I was one of those guys that would love to come visit Indiana and try to steal your companies. So please don't throw anything at me. I don't think we were ever successful with any of that. I got caught up in the whole economic development game of incentives and giving tax credits and loans and all kinds of financing tools to companies to try to move and move into Pennsylvania. Luckily, though, I started learning, and the more I talked to companies and talked to people in the communities throughout the state, I started recognizing that there was something else happening, and that we needed to start thinking more about the place, where that workforce and talent was going to live. We lured a big company into the northeastern part of the state, 1,000 jobs. They never could hire those employees. And so after 5 years, we had put in $200 million. That company left because that part of the area, they couldn't find 1,000 people that wanted to move to that location. For me, that really started clicking in my head. That something different has to happen. So then flash forward to 2015, we did get involved with the Indiana Economic Development Corporation with regional cities. That was an amazing project from a consulting side when you're able to learn, and in most of our projects we do, but that one really, we went around the country. We profiled about 24 different communities. We actually got to visit 13 communities around the country that had transformed themselves, had had population loss, economic loss, a lot of battle scars, but had rebounded and somehow had created a new community. And so we did it all different weight classes, small cities like Manhattan, Kansas, up to Denver, Colorado. And that we found a common thread, that there was this leadership, there was a vision that happened throughout that process. And it was really about the quality of life. It wasn't about really what they were doing to try to lure companies. They just knew they had to create a better place for their residents to live. One thing to note, the Regional Cities program just won a silver medal award from the International Economic Development Council last week. So largely to the work of folks like Greg and the team and all of you that have been part of that effort here in the region and the other two regions that won. It's being recognized now nationally and internationally as a best practice. So kudos to all of you that have been involved in that effort. So all those things started forming in my head that we needed to do something different. And so Fourth Economy, we've been building over the last few years a team of people that have different skill sets in terms of urban planning, arts, social innovation, to really try to think about how do we support the quality of life of the communities that we're working in. So when Greg sent me an email and asked this question, does place matter and why should we invest in it? And he asked if I'd be interested in participating. I said, heck yeah, I would love to come and talk about that. It's an opportunity for us to really form some of our thoughts in a more direct way to help communities and to think about how this matters. So I'm going to go through a presentation that first talks about sort of why we think place matters, gives you some information about a framework for how we think about communities called a community index, and then hopefully give you a little bit of a rally call to sort of take the next step in your development process and what you folks have been investing in. So yeah, so to answer the question, I guess you could say, yeah, sure, we don't need to invest in quality of place. We don't need to think about what's happening. But the challenge is, these are the kinds of communities that we go into. I ask you all to one quick question. So how many of you have driven outside of the region over the last couple of months and then drove back in and had, basically took a hard look at your community? What were you seeing? What's that impression? Has anybody done that recently? Yeah, okay, so a few people. So these are the kinds of buildings, the impressions that we get when we get asked to come and bid on projects. So, you see here there's a theater that's decaying on a main street. You see a former education building that's also decaying. These things leave impressions of anybody that's coming to visit that community, either coming back to visit in-laws or friends, or anybody like us that's coming into a community to sort of take a look and see if we can be helpful. These are relics that sit there and sort of, they tell a story about what may have been there at one time, but they also call into question what's the value system of these communities that these things are allowed to sort of be idle. And especially places like this where you have a large manufacturing enterprise. This is when we visited Detroit. They haven't even tried to clean up the rubble. There's no way that somebody would want to come in here and sort of take over. They think that somehow at some point these could all get turned into apartments, but the condition of all of these buildings is so bad right now that I don't see how that's possible. You also see, things like social halls. Again, what does this mean about the fabric of the community that you're looking at? And then the house here on the right, unfortunately, is 2 houses down from my childhood home in Erie, Pennsylvania. This, unfortunately, is one of the better houses on the block. My mom is actually still in this neighborhood. I'm hoping to get her help her move out soon, but this is the dynamic that you're experiencing because of all that job loss in this community. And you see even the city, they're not repairing sidewalks any longer. They're not repairing streets. It's pretty bad in this part of the community. So these are the impressions that you get when you come into a place. And so this is why we think, quality of place matters. These are issues that need to be addressed if you're really trying to attract population into your communities. And why is that important? So some people say, look, there have been economic cycles all the time, peaks and valleys that are going to happen. We're just, hopefully those buildings will be recaptured at some point or pave way, or knocked down and pave the way for new buildings to be created. But the reality is, I don't think anybody can wait for that. Your communities can't wait for those economic cycles to somehow magically pick up and change what's happening in your communities. And the reason is there are 15 million people each year moving, and that's moving outside of at least their county. 7 million of those 15 are moving outside of their state. So they're making a choice. And more that choice is about they want to be someplace, and then they find a job opportunity. And again, I'll get into that a little bit more later. But so this is the dynamic, right? So when we start talking about numbers of 70,000 here and 30,000 there, it is possible. There is that much flow every year in this country of people moving around. And this is just don't read too much into this. Is just a graphic we've been using to showcase. They're not real numbers, to be honest. I know you're all staring at those, so they're not real numbers. So as we've been forming our company over the past few years, we've been thinking about sort of that mix of how to use data to tell a better story. So a lot of times people have impressions about their community that are either dated or based on some information, conversations they have at dinner parties, but they're not really grounded in sort of reality of sort of what is the data telling us about the community. So about 5 years ago, we started creating something called the Fourth Economy Community Index. So this is an index that looks at 5 core indicators in a community and 19 actual metrics that we were able to bring into the tool. So first is investment, and then you have sustainability, diversity, talent, and place. And so place kind of being a broad terminology, and I'll get into that in a second. But what we've done is, over the last 5 years, we've really looked at what is the impact. Are these indicators really determinants of what's going to happen in a community? And so we've been tracking over time and looking at sort of communities that are doing well or reclining in certain areas of this data, and really determining that, yes, there is a correlation between these indicators and what you're seeing in terms of opportunity for growth in communities. So let me go into those a little bit for you. First area to look at is investment. So in this area, we look at business confidence, building dynamics, so is there churn happening in the building infrastructure, and also looking at overall economic health. In this area, we really think on the investment side, looking at these metrics are critical because at the end of the day, they really underpin sort of what we call confidence, right? So a lot of times people think that investments are happening in communities because somebody's, running the numbers and figuring out, this is a good investment for us. But we want to argue that we think actually those investments are happening far before that because people are thinking in their guts, in their hearts about what a community is all about. So they're seeing the kind of information that's out there, and at the end of the day, do they have confidence that that community has the ability to grow and to attract, and does their investment have the ability to appreciate? And so that's one area that, as you're thinking about quality of places, how are you building confidence within your community that there is an opportunity there? Is there a vision? And how does that spell out in terms of building that business confidence within your community? The second area is something that when I first started in my role in government was something called the crane count, which I didn't understand at first, but it was explained to me that what this means is when you go into a city or go into a community, you look at how many cranes are up, and they don't always have to be these larger cranes, but how much construction activity is happening. And it's a way of sort of determining, is there vibrancy within a community? Is there investment happening? And it's just this visual impression that you get when you go into a community. As part of our work, we also start looking at other building demographics and dynamics that are happening in terms of building permits and the kinds of investment are happening. But all those things need to be looked at as you're thinking about quality of places. What is that dynamism that's happening within the investment side that's building that kind of confidence, as I said? And then the final piece is self. So one of the things we look at and work with communities a lot is sort of, are people engaged in investing in themselves? And whether that's in their property, so their homes, investing in their businesses, especially as a small business side, how much are they investing in their asset that is their self? And is that something that, again, through different kinds of tools and different ways of engaging, can you change that investment level so people start caring more about their community and start making investments in themselves? So the next area we look at is sustainability. Here, there's kind of three core data elements that we look at. Overall community health, so is it a healthy community and it has access, which the data are able to bear out. So obviously, here in this community, hopefully you score well in this area. Environmental quality is another area, so which really looks at, is it a healthy environment for people to live? And then also, is there long-term thinking? And so it's kind of a different, sort of lens to take on sustainability, but is there an opportunity of how people are using resources that they are thinking about 30 and 50 years? To Greg's point, these decisions that we're making now really have long-term implications, and have we thought through what those implications are over that longer-term time horizon? And one of the things that I saw when I came into the community yesterday that I didn't see, 2 years ago or so when I was here last, is that, there are smart investments happening that are thinking long term. So this actually could have been a picture from here. I just hadn't seen it yet. But this idea of the green infrastructure that's happening in this community, that really is a longer term strategy for how do you take something that is an issue that needs to be addressed, but do it in a very smart way and create infrastructure that has a triple bottom or at least a double bottom line benefit in terms of taking care of a water issue, but also creating sort of the green space and the greenery that a community needs. And then the other thing that we're doing a lot lately, so we're part of an international network called the 100 Resilient Cities Network. And one of the things that's really become, it's sort of marrying up now with the way we think about our index, is a resiliency framework, which really looks at shocks and stresses within a community. Shocks are things that you probably can think of, so both economic collapse, so if an industry all of a sudden leaves, or you have, as we've seen recently, if you have natural disasters through storms and the such. And really there, it's really, do you have the ability to respond? Have you played the scenarios of what could happen, and do you as a community have leadership that's able to sort of respond to those kinds of activities? And then the other area is, again, this stress area. And that's something that more and more you're starting to see in economic development world. And stresses are things that, is there an issue around, say, unengaged or disengaged populations? Are there wage gap issues that are causing poverty and widening a gap between poverty and other people that can invest in a community? So they're really looking at stresses that if you do have a shock, or those stresses overall over time can create a shock if they become bad enough that it creates unrest within a community. And you've seen that recently in a number of places, that there are strong stresses that people have known about for times, things like in Ferguson, Missouri, that were ignored. And so a lot of the work and a lot of the cities as part of that international network are really looking at, do we have shocks and stresses that we need to take care of now, in thinking about it under a quality of life framework. Can I grab a bottle of water if you don't mind? Sorry. Thank you. The next area is diversity. So in the diversity framework, we think about a couple different things. One is migration, and really looking at the migration of residents and looking at people, both domestic as well as international. I just spilled water all over myself. Minority participation, really, so then, again, do you have women and minority business ownership, and sort of what's the participation level? And then looking at population diversity. I think one of the things that we've seen more and more is communities are trying to grow, certainly in the Midwest and Northeast, is really trying to, how are you attracting a diverse population into your community? And how do you also provide the quality of life amenities, so the experiences, the kinds of restaurants, the kinds of education opportunities, the kinds of cultural opportunities to support those populations. The next area, and it kind of touches on what was talked about earlier, is the multi-generational. So do you have opportunities there that support multi-generational engagement? And one of the things, I mean, touching on what Chris's data and some of the stuff that Kim had talked about, I think, we're seeing also labor participation rates sort of extending for older adults. And so even though I think we're seeing a trend and a lot of worry in a lot of communities about the white tsunami or the gray tsunami that's happening with all those retirements, there may be some opportunity to engage older individuals in a different way in the workforce. And I think that's partly communities that are thinking about quality of life, are thinking about how do we keep them, and again, it may be a different arrangement for how they're engaged, the type of schedules they have and things like that, but how do you meet them in some middle ground before they completely want to check out and retire from the workforce? And so are there opportunities for them to do that, and are you creating a culture that is supporting that kind of engagement past what is typically going to be considered a retirement year? Again, multicultural. So, do you have opportunities for engagement? We're working in a couple communities that their healthcare system has been trying very talented people are trying very hard to recruit individuals in from international locations and even domestic locations, but they're having a real hard time getting them to fit within the community. There aren't the kind of experiences that are there, and so these folks come in and they work for a year and two, and they realize they just don't feel welcomed in the community and all. So these are difficult issues to tackle, but I think there in that community, what they're trying to do is create sort of almost, in a sense, a couple block areas so that it has the kind of cultural restaurant amenities and an art house that are able to support those people to have an active lifestyle within the community. Again, it's something that a lot of communities are experimenting with, and so we'll see if those work over time. And the final thing I think, you think about this, is really, do people have options? Again, a lot of the locations that we're doing work in, they're wondering why they can't retain either millennials that are moving in or can't attract certain populations. And a lot of times it gets into sort of the housing options, the education options are there. And so you have to think about, do you have also that diversity of institutions and of housing stock and the like that can support that diversity of population that may want to come in? The next area that we look at in the indicator is around talent. And so here, just looking at demographics, looking at education levels and earnings. And so those are obviously pretty straightforward in terms of what's there, but ultimately they're really important, I think, when we think about things like next generation manufacturing. It's happening all over the country that if you think about the way technology adoption's happening in the manufacturing sector, do you have the right tools in place to help your companies think about how to do adoption, maybe how to do shared resources, to think about that next generation manufacturing? And do you have a workforce that's ready to sort of learn along with them? And part of that, obviously this whole session around talent infrastructure is really important, is, what are both all the way from your K through 12 through your graduate level and everything in between, as well as lifelong learning, do you have an opportunity and a system in place that's able to support the talent network throughout? One of the things that we've worked in a number of communities lately where there's a lot of tension between higher education, whether it's certificates and higher education degrees, and the employers who are saying, look, we have this education system that's just not producing the workforce that we need. In a couple of the communities, we've actually, put people in a room and started trying to look at what is that issue, and found that a lot of it's almost a translation gap. On one side, the employers are saying they're not finding the right talent coming out of the schools, but then when you start looking at things like job postings and the job descriptions, the one community we saw, 97% of their job postings were looking for 5 years of experience. Well, it's kind of hard to do while you're still in, you're coming out of school. And so there was a real mismatch between what the HR people and the educators, and honestly, it became just a simple exercise of then having that conversation and figuring out, wait, there's a different pathway. The experience we were looking for was a proxy for something. There's another way that we can get around that. And so unfortunately, that's a lot of trench activity, and you kind of got to get in there and battle it out with the information between your different partners. But that's the kind of thing that we're going to need to have in our talent networks, both within this region and throughout the country. The next area is school performance that we take a look at. And a lot of communities are struggling with performance of their K through 12 system. They've identified that as an issue, but really there's not the kind of leadership that's stepping up and saying, well, what can we do about it? How do we fix it? I mean, there's a lot of end arounds in terms of the types of doing different kinds of school experiences that some communities are doing. But at the end of the day, you have an entire population that is in a school system, largely a lot of times the public school system, that people know that it has issues or that it's failing in some ways. And so trying to tackle that isn't easy, but it kind of takes that civic leadership within a community to step up and do that. One model, if anybody's looking at this, is to look in Nashville. And I think what the Chamber organization has done in Nashville is actually they create a school performance scorecard that's really not on test scores. I mean, that's one component of it, but it's more about the operations of the school. So what's their retention rate in terms of teachers and faculty? What's the quality time that children get to have arts programming and outdoor recreation activities? What's the operations of their building? So it's a very different look at sort of how do you think about school performance. And there was the business community really wanted to step in. They were tired of complaining. They wanted to help. And so they do the scorecard, and they don't just punish schools that aren't performing well. They actually know that those are the schools that they need to go help. And so they help with financial investment as well as mentoring to help fix the issues that are happening in those schools. So it's something I think, as you think about your talent network, it's a tool to think about. And then finally, place. I think, looking at we do look at things like arts and culture, so we look at a couple proxies in terms of how vibrant is your arts and culture community, looking at the affordability of a place and looking at discrepancies between wages and housing costs, and then ease of access, so looking at your transportation system and sort of what's happening within that system. The art and culture side, I think we found is critically important for a number of reasons. We were just talking a little bit about musicians. I mean, one, it creates a vibrancy, it creates a cultural dynamic within your community that you have these opportunities to experience art and for kids and others and all generations to engage in it. But also you find communities that have a strong art and culture representation also have a lot more civic engagement and civic leadership because those folks are problem solvers a lot of times, and they get involved in different ways in their community and can take leadership positions. And so it's important to invest in that. The next area is experience. So I think thinking about the kind of people that you want to recruit and retain within your community, and think about the experiences that they're looking for. We were talking a little bit last night with a couple of folks about, in some ways, a lot of people are rushing into just building trails for everyone. That's not, it's important, and we see trails are really a critical aspect for people looking at recreation opportunities, especially in flat communities like this area. But I think, there's other experiences that people are going to be looking for, and so trying to have a way of capturing what that is and making the investments is critically important. And then finally, brand, and I think a couple of folks have talked about this earlier in terms of the E is for everyone. I think as Greg had reached out and we started doing some research on the community, we saw this, and I think it resonates well in terms of a very welcoming brand and something that is important. And I think that's something that it's really critically important for a community to have that kind of brand because a lot of times, again, using Erie, not to pick on my hometown that much, but in Erie, there is no brand. They've really lost that. There's nobody that's really tried to create that. And so what gets out there in the marketplace is what you see on social media, what you hear from your friends or family when you go back and visit those places or when you go and visit. And you're getting a lot of really bad messages from a community like that. That's their brand. And so, the more that you can get ahead of that and control and find these opportunities to celebrate the diversity that's happening in this community, it's critically important. So it's something that we want to take a look at. So I guess that's our framework for thinking, and I think I just wanted to share that. I mean, the way that we think about quality of place, I mean, each one of those activities that we look at, again, they're indicators. There's data that you can look at, and it creates a dashboard for your community to think about how are you doing. I mean, a lot of what we've talked about, and even I, showed buildings that, are decaying, and we've showed some examples of communities that have done well at fostering quality of place. But a lot of those indicators also get into the intangibles, I think, that are happening within a community that, you also need to focus on. And so hopefully, as you're thinking about the future, that framework, we can give you some ideas in terms of thinking about what's that dashboard that we need to look at our community broadly and to really look for those stresses and shocks that may be coming down the road. And again, some people may think that a lot of this is, we can control our own destiny. If we make these things well, things are going to go great. I think we're also looking at this from a perspective of the more that you think about those kinds of activities, it's also preparing you to deal with the pressure that's coming from outside of your community, from things that you can't control. So the couple things I just want to mention. We talked a little bit about next generation manufacturing, but there's a terminology, fourth industrial revolution. Anybody been hearing this lately? A couple people, okay. So, there's really been this phase that's been happening, and it's just a coincidence that fourth economy and fourth industrial revolution, it seems like as our language has been sort of building, this terminology is being used a lot more by futurists and others, really thinking about sort of the level and sort of the pace that we've seen within the manufacturing sector. And so first, you had the mechanization, sort of what's happening with steam power and those kinds of things. You had mass production, and then you had computers and automation sort of taking over. And really, each one of these cycles is a disruption cycle for the industrial sector. Now you're starting to see the cyber and physical systems. This terminology is also used in a lot of other areas, whether it's healthcare, manufacturing, IT. I mean, you're seeing more and more through things like the Internet of Things that sort of changing the way that we all behave, the way that systems interact. And so this is a force that's going to disrupt, again, all those industries within your community, and are you prepared to sort of deal with those? So my daughter, my 12-year-old, likes when I put cats and dogs, so this one's for her. Is that okay? Yeah, a couple good. So migration is an issue that I think it's one of the things that we've started thinking a lot about over the last couple of years, in that, is when Chris is presenting the data about the retirements and things like that, we're seeing migration as a potential unknown, that we really aren't clear sort of when people are going to have enough of living in certain climates, in certain areas where they have severe weather events. So this is actually a poor little pooch that was trying to walk around the streets of Phoenix this summer. It was 116 degrees real temp. The asphalt was 162 degrees. So that was for about a week. They had those kinds of temperatures. There's pictures also of garbage cans, the plastic recycling cans on the street corners melting. It was so hot in certain areas. The question for us is, at what point in time are those people going to start thinking about maybe, this climate, when I thought we were getting into the Sun Belt, it's not what it was cracked up to be, and it's not what I want long term. And so can places like Indiana, like this region, start becoming that home, that new home for these folks as they start thinking about where they may want to be in the future? And in other areas, there's conversation about should Houston rebuild in certain areas. I hate to prey on people that are in a time of crisis, but at the same time, there is going to be some question about where do we rebuild some of these communities, and is that again an opportunity to sort of recruit some of those individuals that may want a different opportunity going forward. The other reason why all this is important is choice, and I think we've heard a little bit about millennials, and I think they're not the only population demographic that has the ability to relocate, but it's the one that's studied the most because of just the size of what's happening. It's something, hopefully Kim and I can share some more notes about this later on and how these things relate. But this idea that 70% of millennials choose a location, based on the quality of life. So, and they're looking at things like economic mobility. So is there opportunity within that community to move up on the economics? Is there access? So is there good transportation? Are there bike lanes? Are there other ways to sort of engage in getting access to different things? And then is there diversity? And so, are there opportunities to experience different kinds of cultures, different kinds of artistic events, those kinds of things? And so they look for those things first. And I can attest to it. I mean, I'm in Pittsburgh. We've had 2 employees that have come to our company that came to me with a spreadsheet that had 20, we're all geeks, by the way. They came in with a spreadsheet that had 27 variables or so of what cities they were looking for in the country. And somehow Pittsburgh, sort of fit their bill. Unfortunately for both of them, they didn't look at our air quality, which is something that once they moved to Pittsburgh, they regretted dearly and are both now very active in trying to tackle our air quality issues in our community. But that's the kind of behavior that you're seeing. I mean, it's probably a little extreme in terms of spreadsheets, but that's how people are thinking about where they want to be in the future. And we're even seeing that some of the trends in college and university enrollment are also following that pattern. Kids are looking for a place where they want to be, not just the programs at a school, but also looking for a location that they want to live in. So I guess, at the end of the day, I feel like a lot of times these days I'm a preacher more than anything. A lot of times I'm going into communities and Unfortunately, my team's been calling me Chicken Little lately because I'm always going into a community looking at data and telling them that the sky is falling in some fashion. But at the end of the day, I think it's important, though, because, again, I think looking at the information, that data, and really making sure that your perception is aligned with really what the reality is going to be critical. I mentioned before a couple times, I think, civic leadership. I think it's the one thing that, a lot of communities, and I've seen so much of it here, I guess, over the last, 2 days that I've been here, that in this community, it feels like there is really strong civic leadership that's willing to commit and that is committed to the future of the community. That's a rare thing these days. I think, I can't tell, and Kim may be able to help me, if that's a generational issue, because the boomers had a different experience from the millennials, from the Gen Xers like myself, and I think, is that part of, they need to have a translator to figure out how to make civic leadership work again? But it's something that's important to have, because I think it has to be both for the initial, sort of excitement around thinking about a vision and a plan, but also over the long haul. And how do you have that civic leadership that's also able to sort of recognize when things aren't going well, being able to do course corrections, and being able to honor one another and sort of that commitment that they've made to the community. So that's something that's important. So I guess the question is, will Southwest Indiana stand out? So as we started, we're looking at preparing for this presentation, there's a couple things we took a look at, right? So the one's the regional cities plan. And so it's an aggressive plan, 70,000, trying to attract 70,000 people by 2025, retention of a number of different categories of individuals, investment in a lot of different areas of the community. But that's all good. You have a vision. There are so many communities, I can tell you, around this country that really lack any kind of North Star of where they want to be, where in really understanding sort of what are the things that they want to strive for. And so a lot of times they're rudderless. And so you see projects happening here, project happening there. They're trying some kind of shotgun approach. And I think, so you need this kind of vision, and it's something that also needs to be invested in both in the short and the long term in terms of time and effort of that civic leadership. So there's a quote here from the great author and boxer Evander Holyfield. So when I saw this, it kind of begged a question for me. Again, I love this idea of stay on your toes and always move forward, right? So, for this kind of effort, for a quality of life and a quality of place effort, it really means, like, are you thinking, are you on your toes? Do you have the right information? Again, hopefully things like that framework of thinking about the index indicators, are those the kinds of inputs that you want to be looking at to think about how do you stay ahead of the curve and what you're thinking about in your community? And then are you moving forward? There will be setbacks in any of these kinds of things when you're thinking about quality of place. There will be setbacks, but are you doing enough then as a group of leaders in your community to move forward and make things happen? And finally, one of the bigger things that we've seen, I think, when we looked at all those different communities around the country, the one thing we saw again over and over again was really having that sustained focus, and we saw that really being underpinned by this idea of celebrating success. I think it's something that sometimes, in the grind of trying to implement plans and raise dollars, success is won and celebrated in small conference rooms and areas like that. I think we're seeing those communities are really successful. They're doing that at scale. They're reveling in the opportunity to celebrate that success together, to honor the commitments that have been made from their peers within the community and from outside. And so that's something important, I think, as you think about quality of place. Find those opportunities to celebrate the success that you have and talk about them broadly within the community, because that builds that confidence. As I mentioned before, it's the kind of thing that builds that investment confidence, that people feel good about their community, that they feel it's on the right track. And so that's something to think about going forward. So that concludes my remarks. I do think, as I've looked at this community and really what's going on, I think that the quality of life investments, even the things that I've seen over the past 2 years since I've been here, are amazing. I mean, the progress that you've made. I think there's a lot still to be done, though, right? So the data that you heard from Chris, some conversations I had tonight, there's a lot more that needs to happen. And so hopefully, as you think about the future of this community and the kinds of investments you need, you're going to double down, and that you are going to, form together, bond together, battle it out through all the obstacles that you'll face, but do that as a community and as a civic leadership focused on, how do you build a better, stronger community for the residents that are here now and attract some of those folks, some of those 15 million that move every year. So with that, I guess I can answer some questions if anybody has them. I know, so I stand between you and ice cream, but, we'll see how that works. Yes?
What recommendations, I guess, do you have on what we could do to try to draw talent into the community?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple things. Like, I do think the brand that you have, right? I do think, and my understanding now is more of an internal, the EAFs for everyone is kind of something that you've been building here in the region. I think that will play well, I think, nationally. I think that as people think about a place that they want to be, especially the stories, it's hard not to look at individual stories. So I know I went onto the website and found myself an hour later, like, still reading, like, your individual stories of people in your community. I think that's important. I do think thinking about, the issues that you have in terms of the labor force. Obviously you have lots of jobs open, and so those two things will happen. But I think trying to find even other creative solutions for engaging people that may want to retire, try to hold on to them a little bit, but also thinking about other creative solutions. So the pilot you're doing, I think, make a lot of sense from that perspective. Yeah, and I think, as regional cities, as those kinds of projects, I think about what's that next phase, right? So, like, what do you do next? Because those plans all have a shelf life. You're accomplishing a lot of the goals pretty quickly. Don't let that sit. Start thinking now, like, what's that next generation look like? And Greg can throw something at me if I've said anything wrong, I guess. Okay, yeah.
I was struck by your observation about aligning what higher education institutions are doing, or secondary institutions, and what the needs are of companies in a region. You talked about the fact that you found that 95% of the jobs were asking for 5 years. Could you elaborate a little bit on how a community ought to respond to that? Because I'm in higher ed, we can't offer that experience, that vocational experience, but we're anxious to work with companies in the area to bridge that gap. What are some of the solutions you might suggest for addressing that issue?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One, there's kind of a brand, Chris, I don't know if you've seen this lately, but sort of this next generation partnership model that the folks are trying to pursue. And it's an interesting model where you're really bringing the industry players around the table in certain sectors, IT, healthcare, manufacturing, and really, trying to get them to open up more than just having the screaming at their partners saying, you're not supplying what I need and I need to hire quickly. I think having them really address and sort of almost tear apart, like, what are those skill sets you're really looking for? And then working with higher ed and other education providers within the community to figure out how do we build a new model for how to almost like just-in-time training for those kinds of skill sets. So create sort of the common level, proficiency level within certain areas, but then figure out those specialty areas. Honestly, a lot of it's just getting in the room and being honest with one another and spending, that work that we've done. It was out in the New England state. It took a lot of meetings, to be honest, to get to that point, to understand sort of that data mismatch and what to do about it. So you have to have that commitment up front on both sides of the equation to really sit down and try to figure it out. Any other questions? Thanks.
Thanks, Rich.